Great, so thanks, and thank you so much to the organizers for putting this together and for inviting me to be here. I think it was such a nice idea to try to have some social element, and it's sort of exciting to see things like this starting to happen again, and hopefully this is the tip of the iceberg. So thank you guys all so much. And it's fun to give an in-person talk. I gave like a lot of talks over the last year and a half on my computer in my room, and it's super weird to be up, standing, and walking around. So hopefully this all still works. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is work that my group has been doing on trying to understand how we can reduce the spread of misinformation and fake news online. And this includes things like the sort of 2016 vintage fake news, things like this, Pope endorses Donald Trump, which is totally not true, just entirely fabricated, but went viral and got, thousands of shares and likes on social media. And that's this is the kind of thing that got fake news on everybody's minds. Then during the pandemic, there was a sort of resurgence of interest in misinformation because there was lots of COVID-related misinformation going on. This thing has been coined like an infodemic that is in parallel to the pandemic. There was this infodemic of all kinds of misinformation, leading people to do crazy different things, and also creating resistance to things like masking and vaccination and so on. And then during the 2020 election, there also was a ton of misinformation going on, particularly related to election fraud and just totally false, baseless claims of election fraud that have really gotten deep traction with a lot of people in the US. So the key that we want to understand is what can be done to fight misinformation. And although misinformation occurs on many channels, what I'm particularly focusing on is what can social media platforms do to fight misinformation, because I think this is a place where there's actually some possibility of action, because the platforms could actually do something. Like if Fox News is putting out lots of misinformation, Fox News owns Fox News, and Fox News doesn't have any interest in not putting out misinformation, so there's not like a lot of scope for action there. Whereas on social media, the people that are producing the misinformation are not the same people that are distributing it, and so there's some potential. And all of the major social media platforms have at least some interest in addressing the misinformation problem. And because they're first and foremost technology companies, the standard approach that they have taken is machine learning. And just being like, okay, great, all we need is a fake news classifier, get a good fake news classifier, then we just downrank all the fake news and we're done, like, great. But this doesn't work that well. There's a lot of problems with this. One thing is that once you start digging into it a little, you realize that truth is not this very clear, nice binary thing where you can make a good training set of here's the true ones, here's the false ones, okay, learn. And also there's a big non-stationarity problem where, like, if you're always training your model on yesterday's training set, tomorrow's misinformation could look a lot different, where the COVID pandemic was a good example of that. There was this whole new class of misinformation that came online that they were really not prepared for. So there's some sense that although machine learning can help, it's not a complete solution. And so the other thing that platforms have been doing a lot of is partnering with professional fact-checking organizations like Snopes.com or PolitiFact, where you have trained journalists who research articles and then say, oh, this is true, or this is misleading, or this is false, and then they'll maybe put a label on it or downrank it and use those ratings to help inform the models. And I think also fact-checking is great. We've done a bunch of research that suggests if something's labeled as false, people are less likely to believe it and less likely to share it. But the problem with professional fact-checking is it's just not scalable. Like, there's not very many professional fact-checkers. It takes a long time to do the detailed research, and so there's just no way that they can possibly keep up with the massive volume of content that's being posted every day. So what we want to try and understand is what are other approaches that can be added to the sort of anti-misinformation toolkit to complement what's going on already. And the approach that we're taking is to sort of ask a more fundamental question from a kind of cognitive science perspective of why is it that people share misinformation in the first place? And then based on that, see what we can figure out about what to do about it. So the simplest explanation, I think, for why people share misinformation is they just can't tell what's true. Everyone's doing their best to share the things that to only share true things, but people are just very confused. And so to get a sense of how well this sort of confusion can account for misinformation sharing, we ran a bunch of experiments, one of which I'll tell you here. We recruited about 1,000 people from Mechanical Turk. We showed them a set of 24 headlines, half true and half false, half right-leaning and half left-leaning. And we randomized them into 2 conditions. In the sharing condition, we showed everything in Facebook format, and we said, if you saw this, would you consider sharing it online? And in the accuracy condition, we showed them exactly the same stimuli, but instead we asked, to the best of your knowledge, is this claim accurate? And so then we're going to look at the fraction of headlines rated as accurate or considered for sharing based on whether they're false or true, and whether they align with the participant's ideology or didn't. And if you start with the accuracy judgments, you see for this particular set of headlines, the people are actually doing quite well. They believe the true headlines much more than they believe the false headlines. And they only believe the politically concordant headlines a bit more than they believe the discordant ones. So that looks pretty promising. And if the misinformation sharing problem was just about confusion, we'd expect the sharing plot to look similar. But in fact, it looks radically different when it comes to sharing, even in this survey context where people might be wanting to present themselves to look good and not admit that they would share false content, and people might be paying more careful attention than usual because they're in a survey or whatever. Even in that context, whether it's true or false has basically no impact on their sharing. And they're much more likely to share the things that align with their politics than the things that don't. And this dissociation between accuracy judgments and sharing intentions is most stark if you look at headlines that are false but aligned with the participant's ideology. Here, the people in the accuracy condition, let's say the people in the sharing condition, were twice as likely to say they would share these false headlines as the people in the accuracy condition were to rate them as accurate. And so it suggests, although there is some confusion going on because people do think some of the false headlines are true, it's clearly there's something more than just confusion going on, and there is this big disconnect. So, okay, what's going on? Why is there a disconnect between accuracy and sharing? The response that might come first to mind, and that a lot of people have made arguments for, is that we're in this post-truth world where people just don't care about accuracy anymore, or at least they care about other things more, like their partisanship. And so they're perfectly happy to share things that they know are false if they think it advances their agenda or makes them look good or will get a lot of clicks or whatever. And we actually are going to argue against this. And we're going to say, although this maybe happens to some extent, something else that I think is much more important and plays a much bigger role is just inattention, which is when you're on social media, you're scrolling quickly. You've got your news is mixed in with cat videos and baby pictures and whatever kind of stuff. So you're not really, where accuracy isn't even a meaningful concept. And so you're not thinking about accuracy, and instead what you're seeing is very immediately quantified social feedback, how many people liked each thing, how many people shared things, and so that's focusing your attention on the social dimension and away from the accuracy dimension. So even if you're someone that really cares about accuracy and doesn't want to share inaccurate content, you may wind up doing it anyways because you just forget to stop and think, oh wait, is this actually accurate? And I actually have done it myself. I retweeted something that then, as someone that works on all this, and then someone a couple hours later was like, yo, is that true? And I was like, oh my God, So yeah, and in the paper, we formalized this with a limited attention utility model that I'm not going to go into detail here, but the basic idea is, in normal utility calculus, you've got a utility function where you've got all the different things you care about, and then you've got a weight on each of those terms in the utility function, and you pick the thing that, for each option, you add it up, and the one that gives you more utility, great, you go home. But the idea here is that because of attentional constraints, particularly when you're kind of scrolling quickly on social media, you can't consider all of your preferences. And so you only consider a subset of the preferences in the utility function. And so in addition to just your preference weight, which is how much you care about each term, there's also this attentional component, which is either 0 or 1. And you only get to use a subset of them. And so this is sort of what I mean is you have a strong weight on accuracy. So say this is the disutility you get from sharing something that's false, even if you have a large weight on that preference. So conditional on considering it, you would never share something inaccurate. If you just never even consider it in the first place, like if that's 0, that whole term drops out. And so if that's right, then just getting people to consider accuracy, that is not giving them any new information, not whatever, just shifting their attention towards accuracy should make them more discerning in their sharing. And so to test this hypothesis, we ran a bunch of experiments. In a first such experiment, we again recruited 700 people. We showed them a set of 24 headlines, half true, half false, half right-leaning, half left-leaning. And in the control, we just said, if you were to see it on Facebook, how likely would you be to share it? And consistent with what I showed you before, there's basically no difference in how likely people are to share the true versus false headlines. And then the treatment is exactly the same thing, but on every item, first we say, how accurate is it? And then we say, would you share it? So we force them to consider accuracy before they decide what to share. So we call this like a full attention treatment, where you know for sure they've attended to accuracy on every item. And what you see is that cuts the sharing of the false headlines in half. And then also, because in the treatment for these people that are sharing the false headlines, you also have their accuracy ratings. You can decompose this into how much of this is people who mistakenly thought it was true and then said they would share it, versus people who said it was false and still said they would share it. And what you see is that the blue is the ones where they rated it as accurate incorrectly and then said they would share it, and orange is where they knew it was false and decided to share it anyways. And so from this, you can infer that of this baseline sharing of false content, half of it was simply due to forgetting to think about accuracy, a third of it was being confused, and only a sixth of it was this kind of post-truth purposeful sharing of false content. So this is just to say that these exact percentages will certainly vary depending on what specific headlines you use and whatever. But the point is, this inattention thing isn't just some weird little bit on the margin. It's an important part of what's going on. But obviously, no social media company is going to ask people to rate the accuracy of every item before they share it. That's just a non-starter. So we want to know what are things that you can do to just nudge people to pay a little more attention to accuracy. And so we've done this in a bunch of ways. And the one that we've done the most, we call the evaluation treatment, is at the beginning of the study, we just show them a random non-political headline and say, hey, as part of another task, help us rate the accuracy of this. So we just ask them to rate how accurate is this one random headline. Then they go on to the main task where they do their sharing intentions. But because they rated accuracy once at the beginning, it's just primed the concept of accuracy, so they're more likely to stop and think about whether the other stuff is accurate. And consistent with this, here's another experiment. This little accuracy prime at the beginning significantly reduces the sharing of false content and doesn't really do anything to the treatment. And so it triples the discernment. That is, the difference in sharing of true versus false is like 3 times bigger in the treatment compared to the control. We've shown that these kind of minimal digital literacy tips do the similar thing. I don't think this teaches anyone anything they didn't know already, but just showing that primes the concept of accuracy. You can also do it by asking them how important it is to them to only share accurate content. Basically, everybody says it's very important, and then they're more likely to be like, oh yeah, I guess I should think about the accuracy. And we found that just providing descriptive norms and saying most other people think it's important didn't really do much on its own, but there was some evidence that it made other interventions more potent. So we've run a ton of these experiments. We just posted this preprint where we did a sort of internal meta-analysis of all 20 experiments we ran 2017 through 2020 with 26,000 participants in the US. And we find that the prompts work. It's a very replicable effect. It works for headlines that are aligned with your ideology and headlines that aren't. It works for COVID headlines, and no difference in how well it works for COVID versus political headlines. Sadly, because COVID is politics, probably. But whatever, that's a whole other issue. It works for both conservatives and liberals. For the COVID headlines, it works for both people that are low and high in COVID concern. So it's quite a robust phenomena. When we fit that limited attention model that I talked about before to the data, it suggests that people have a very strong preference for not sharing inaccurate content, but just often fail to attend to it, kind of as per our suggestion. And we also recently are doing some work where we're fitting drift diffusion models to the data, because we have reaction time data for all the things for people that know about drift diffusion models, which are cool. And it also supports this account that what the treatment is doing is it's just making people take accuracy into account to a greater extent when they're deciding what to share. So that's all encouraging, but so far everything that I've showed you and almost everything we've done has been with American subjects. But misinformation is very much a global problem. And when talking to people at social media companies, they're actually much more worried about misinformation outside of the US than inside the US. So in March, we did a big cross-cultural study, so 34,000 people from 16 countries on 6 continents. And we did a bunch of different things, but one of the things that we did is this same accuracy nudge where, in the control, they just say how likely they would be to share a bunch of different headlines about COVID. And in the treatment, we asked them to rate the accuracy of one random non-COVID headline at the outset, and then they do the sharing task. So they just sort of prime the concept of accuracy. And this shows the change in discernment, so the change in essentially like the quality of what they're sharing as a function of receiving the intervention. The meta-analytic estimate across all of the countries is around a 20% increase in the quality of what they're sharing. And there clearly is variation across countries, but actually what explains that variation is countries where people are worse at baseline, the treatment has a bigger effect. So it's funny that actually like the US is one of the countries where people are least discerning at baseline in their sharing, and that's where the treatment has one of the biggest effects. But so it's not the case of, it only works in places where things were good anyways. So this suggests it's also not unique to the US. So all of this is very encouraging, but a major limitation of everything that I've showed you so far is that we're using sharing intentions as the key outcome rather than actual sharing. And so we want to know, does this really work in the real world? So we go to the field, and we ran this field experiment. We created a bunch of Twitter accounts that presented themselves as bots and sort of non-political bots. We went with cooking bot. So we made a bunch of cooking bots. And then with the cooking bots, we followed over 130,000 users that had recently tweeted links to Breitbart or InfoWars, like right-leaning misinformation sites. Of those, about 11,000 of them followed our accounts back. And so that creates a subject pool that we can send direct messages to. Of that 11,000, we went through and we kicked out all the ones that looked like were bots themselves or had not been that active. And so we wound up with a little over 5,000 regular misinformation sharing users that were following us. And then we did an experiment that was essentially a replication of what we did in the survey experiments, which is we sent them a private message that just said, how accurate is this headline? We showed them this random non-political headline, said, hey, thanks for following me. Can I ask you a favor? I'm wondering how accurate this is. I'm doing a survey to find out. Like, what do you think? And so basically nobody responds. Like fewer than 10% of the people respond to the message, but that's fine. We don't need them to respond. We just need them to open it and like read that top sentence, and they've been treated in the sense that the concept of accuracy has been activated in their mind. And so then we want to know what's the effect of this on the quality of the news that they share. Basically, because, well, for whatever practical reasons, we don't just have like a control group and a treatment group, but instead we do a thing where everyone gets the message, but you randomize who gets the message on which day. So basically, like every day is its own mini experiment where you compare the people that haven't gotten the message yet are the control, and the people that get the message on that day are the treatment. And what we find, consistent with everything else, is we see a significant increase in the average quality of the links that the people share, where quality is judged at the domain level. We have this set of 60 domains that fact checkers rated the trustworthiness of the domains. And so we find that, yeah, the treatment increases the average quality. And to sort of visualize it, I'm going to show you one dot per domain. The size of the dot is proportional to the pre-treatment number of tweets. So it gives you a sense of what the baseline sharing behavior of these people are. And then on the x-axis, we have the rating of that outlet by professional fact checkers. And on the y-axis, we have the effect of our treatment on the fraction of people's tweets that point to that outlet. So positive means it increases sharing of that outlet. negative means decreases. And so what you can see, most importantly, there is like a positive correlation such that the treatment effect moves sharing more in line with fact-checker trust judgments. And most notably, even though we selected these people because they shared Breitbart, the treatment significantly decreases the share of their tweets to Breitbart and increases the share to things like The Times and CNN. It translates into about a 5% increase in the average quality among people that tweeted, more than triples the discernment, that is the difference in number of links to mainstream versus misinformation sites tweeted each day. The effect is specific to retweets and not primary tweets, which fits with this limited attention account. So retweets, you're just scrolling through, you're like, oh, that looks cool, yeah, okay, that looks cool, great. Whereas when you actually write a tweet, you're like slave over it to make sure every letter is perfect. So where the limited attention is happening is in the context of retweets, and that's where this thing actually works. And also we found that the treatment was as effective, if not more effective, for users that had more followers. So that means from a sort of practical perspective, it actually seems promising for you can treat the people who it would be most useful to treat. And this Twitter data is massively more complicated than survey experiment data. So we also do one of these things where we pick the specification we thought was best, but we show that across 192 different analytic approaches, you get mostly significant results. So it's a sort of robust, significant result. And basically the suggestion is that platforms could do things like while you're scrolling through your feed, here as I'm going to show it as a pop-up, it could also be as an in-feed. Occasionally, you get something that says, hey, help us inform our algorithms. How accurate is this headline? And then the point is they could just throw away the responses, and just having people make the responses in the first place will make them more discerning in their subsequent sharing because it will direct their attention towards accuracy. And so what's nice about this is it's a distributed solution in the sense that it doesn't rely on a centralized definition of true and false. It doesn't have somebody labeling posts one way or the other. Instead, it's just kind of leveraging people's own ability and inclination to identify and not share misinformation when they actually think about it. And so that also means it's scalable because it doesn't require the fact checkers to be keeping up with the stream of misinformation. It's just getting the people sort of to do it themselves. Obviously, and also we do some computer simulations in the paper to show that the treatment effects can be amplified by network effects, because if you don't share it, none of your followers even see it, so they don't have the chance to share it, so none of their followers see it, and so on and so forth. And this is basically like a proof of concept. There's a lot of room for optimizing the size of the treatment effect and figuring out ways to make it so that people don't start ignoring it. Because in the attention game, if you just do the same thing every time, pretty quickly people will stop paying attention to that. As good academics, we publish papers. And I guess we have a bunch of papers by now, but these are sort of like the main ones of this. We had a paper in Psych Science on the COVID stuff and a paper in Nature on the political stuff with all the models and everything. But also, if the main goal of, the reason I started doing all this work was, trying to actually have impact. So we also are doing a lot of trying to work with tech companies to get this stuff implemented. So TikTok just read about our stuff, even without us reaching out to them, thought it was cool, and then designed an intervention sort of inspired by the things that we did, found that it worked, and built it into their standard interface. We also have been working with Jigsaw, which is Google's security R&D unit, for a couple of years on trying to develop the accuracy prompts into a toolkit that platforms can use. Finally, Facebook is showing some interest after years of trying to needle them about it, and so hopefully something is rolling there. And Twitter has done a bunch of things that are in this vein, like asking people, do you want to, are you sure you want to share that? We haven't read it, and things like that. And then also, it's not just in the hands of tech platforms. Also, philanthropic groups or individuals can do it by buying ads that sort of serve accuracy nudges to people that you think are likely to share misinformation. So we worked with one nonprofit during the 2020 election. They hired some ad agency to make this little ad based on our research, and then they paid to show it to people. They bought Google ads on disinformation sites showing this ad, and they found that it got way more engagement than the normal ads they ran. And so then some other Democratic group spent $2 million buying, like blanketing disinformation websites in Georgia during the 2020 Georgia runoffs with these ads. They got like 64 million impressions in 4 weeks or something like that. And obviously we don't know what effect it had because it wasn't a real experiment, but at least it's evidence that you can deploy it and people will watch it. And from other stuff, we've done experiments where in a survey experiment context, watching this video makes people substantially more discerning in their sharing. So hopefully that did something good out there. Oh yeah, right, and then the last thing is it's also not just in the hands of people with a lot of money, but you can also do it yourself as a social media user. It's like when you make posts about the concept of accuracy, that all the people that read it, like, oh yeah, right. And so in a funny kind of meta thing, my tweet thread about the paper, which itself went somewhat viral, was actually delivering the intervention that the paper was about itself, because everyone that read it presumably thought about accuracy afterwards. So that's the basic idea. The last thing that I just want to say is that I was saying that if they did something like this, they could throw away the answers and it would still be useful. But we also are interested in, should they throw away the answers, or are the answers actually useful? And so we've been doing a bunch of work on crowdsourcing and trying to see, can you make fact-checking scalable by using the wisdom of crowds? And so we have this paper that just got accepted at Science Advances where we had this set of 200-odd headlines that an internal Facebook algorithm flagged and that Facebook shared with us. And we had them fact-checked by fact-checkers and rated by Amazon, like politically balanced groups of Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. Basically, we found, this is showing the correlation between the fact-checker research and the Amazon people just reading the headline as a function of the number of Turkers, Turk ratings used per headline, and use the correlation between the fact-checker ratings as our baseline, which is actually far below 1, which is another interesting thing that emphasizes what I said at the beginning, that truth is not a super clear-cut thing. There's clearly signal there, but it's noisy. And so basically, we found with groups of, say, 15 Turkers just reading the headline, the agreement between the Turkers and the fact-checkers was as good as the agreement amongst the fact-checkers. And it was even better for political headlines than non-political headlines. And so I think that they shouldn't be throwing away the responses, but crowdsourcing also is super useful. And this has been starting to take off. We worked with Facebook as part of that to help them design this community review product where they hire lay people to rate articles. And that's part of their process. And Twitter just introduced Birdwatch recently, which is their own version of that. And so I'm on the advisory board for Birdwatch, and it will be interesting to see how that all shakes out. So just to wrap it up, the idea is using machine learning and professional fact checkers is good. I'm not saying to stop doing that, but I think it's not a complete solution. And our work suggests that lay people are surprisingly good at and invested in information quality if they actually pay attention. And so that means that you can get them to be more discerning in what they share by just shifting their attention back to accuracy. And you can use crowdsourcing to kind of leverage that collective intelligence. And so both of these things are scalable approaches to reducing misinformation that don't rely on sort of a centralized authority deciding what to censor and what to allow. And so we think these are very promising additions to the anti-misinformation toolkit. And we're excited, hopeful that some of this stuff will actually get adopted. So thanks so much for listening. These are lots of people, most of them, but not all of them at MIT, who worked on a lot of this stuff, people that gave us money. And thanks everybody for listening. All right, shoe coming untied doesn't happen during Zoom talks. So questions?
One question I had was, have you looked into rating people as trustworthy as opposed to articles? Because that would be more tractable in terms of people rating where the information is coming from instead of the abstract information.
Yeah.
The other question that I had was with respect to people sharing as opposed to people estimating the truthfulness of something. Is there any evidence that giving a nudge towards truthfulness, although it optimizes sort of the truthfulness of the information, doesn't actually disemphasize other criteria that might have been important? So let's say in the decision to share, they were evaluating both truthfulness and kindness and something else.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can't give too many nudges.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so on the second part, for sure, we conceptualized this in this sort of attention being zero sum. And so if you're directing attention towards some things, it's away from other things. And we were focusing on, it's away from, does this align with my politics? But it's an interesting question if it's also directing it away from other things that would be good normatively, like, is this kind or whatever. So yeah, it's a cool idea that we haven't actually thought about. We should look into that. Particularly if some of the platforms test this at scale, they can look at its effect on all different kinds of content. And in terms of rating the people rather than rating the articles, that's actually where we started. In this case, we were rating outlets. And so we found that we had just like lay people rate this set of 60 outlets. And we found, well, this is actually showing that not much disagreement between Democrats and Republicans, and maybe the part that's more important is the correlation between the ratings among the, wait a minute. Oh, well, I think this is actually mislabeled now that I look about it. That's funny. Oh, no, never mind. That's right. Because I usually don't use this thing from the paper, but the version that I made. Anyways, the point is that for both Democrats and Republicans, the layperson ratings correlate with the fact checker ratings pretty well because nobody trusts the mainstream nobody trusts the hyperpartisan or fake news outlets. And more generally, what I think you can do that is more efficient is you can have people rate individual articles, but that you can roll those articles up to create domain level scores or page level scores. And so you can say, what's the average quality of all the stuff that a given that's coming from a given outlet or shared by a given page or even shared by a given person. And then you can have these sort of person level ratings, which are presumably more stable and less susceptible to mistakes than headline level stuff.
Do you ask the partners if they use any linguistic cues or just rote knowledge to make their accuracy prediction? And do you think that's going to get more complicated as we see more and more machine-generated texts in our news sources?
So what people are doing to make their accuracy judgments is a whole interesting other question that we've done a bunch of work on. That's actually where we started before we got to the sharing stuff. And my sense, so people weirdly don't use the source as a major cue. Like you can hide the source or emphasize like the domain that it comes from, or you can hide the domain or emphasize the domain. Doesn't make much difference. People that engage in more thinking are less likely to believe false headlines, and putting people under a cognitive load and time pressure makes them more likely to believe false headlines. So like thinking is good. What exactly they're thinking about, we have some work that suggests that what they're thinking about is essentially how well does this cohere with my prior factual beliefs about the world? Like, does this seem crazy or not? But we haven't looked at the sort of level of granularity of what you're talking about, and I think that would be super interesting.
Have you compared the effect of nudging to, like, I've observed on Facebook and Instagram now, they have these, like, censored, like, this post may not be true kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's great. I think like putting labels on things definitely is effective. It makes people share them a lot less, and it makes people believe them less. But the problem, again, is sort of the scalability. That is, if you were able to put a warning on everything that was bad, that would go a long way. But they just, they can't. Also, I forgot to say it's slow. So during peak virality sort of spreading, that's when the fact checkers are doing the research, while the thing is out there in the wild. Basically, yeah. And the other problem is, saying this idea that it's not really true versus false, but rather this more of a continuum of like how misleading is this. And so I think it's feasible to put like warnings on stuff that's really bad, but there's a lot of stuff in the middle that's like not bad enough to say this is false, but is bad enough that I don't want people to share it, and they probably wouldn't want to share it if they thought about it. And we also have some work that if people are being Bayesian, which M-Turkers are and people from more representative samples aren't really. But if they were being Bayesian, then they should infer that if some stuff has a warning on it, everything that doesn't have a warning on it might have been fact-checked and validated. So we find that in some settings, if you put warnings on some stuff, it makes them share the unlabeled false or misleading stuff more. So, yeah.
I wonder if you could, great talk, I wonder if you could speak to some of the other explanations people give for like misuse of social media, like how rewarding it is, sort of, what are like alternative hypotheses for what an attention nudge towards accuracy is doing or what other interventions would do. For example, is that just generally slowing people down and making their use of social media different? And so they're not having as much fun, maybe they're not, in pop language, it's not as much of a dopamine experience. Have you looked at any of these sort of other interventions? Have you had like false, like not so success stories of things you thought, maybe that'll work and it didn't quite?
Yeah, I mean, well, okay. So I guess one question is are the accuracy nudges just like getting people to slow down and think more in general, or is it like what I'm talking about is specifically focusing them on accuracy? And one piece of evidence that we have for that is when we fit the drift diffusion models to all the data, you can sort of get from that like a sense of it, to the extent it's changing what they're thinking about, or it's just changing how much they're thinking by adjusting the bounds for people that are into DDMs. And that stuff suggests that it's not making them think more, but rather it's just changing what they're thinking about when they're deciding what to share. It's sort of making accuracy play a bigger role rather than just making them think more in general. But I think what you're talking about is sort of active areas that we are working on now, sort of better specifying this. I don't know how we're doing on time.
We can take a couple more questions.
Yeah, so how minimal a nudge does this accuracy nudge need to be? So you just gave them a true false trivia question with that to it, or does it specifically need to be like accuracy and
It's a good question. And basically, I don't know. But I think that in this paper where we, like all these different things that I showed you where it's like, judge the accuracy of this random headline, here's some news tips, and like how important is it to you to share accurate stuff, all of those were equally effective. And then things where we made them do, instead of judging the accuracy of one headline, we made them do 10 headlines. That was more effective. And in general, in the meta-analysis, we can be like, if you stack things, the more interventions you do, the bigger the effect is. But so yeah, I don't really know how low you could go in terms of, and we haven't played around with the details of like, is this a trivia question versus the headline, and are you asking about accuracy versus true or whatever? But yeah, that's an open question. My guess is it should be pretty general because it just has to get you thinking about like, are things true or not? But yeah.
So I have a question that, so basically like regarding the topic, why wouldn't we label people somehow share this information? So I have a different perspective on this. I'm afraid, after watching this documentary, Requiem for the American Dream, I'm not sure if you watched it from Tom Cruise. I'm afraid of concentration of power, and these social media like have a lot of power over people. And I personally think that's going to violate, like labeling people in that sense, like literally, is going to violate people's freedom of speech to some extent. But at the same time, it's important, maybe there's some gray, like there's a huge gray area. So I just wanted to convey this point here and ask you whether you have any thoughts on like, how to deal with this, because some people might be sharing things that they think is right. It might not be their fault, and shutting them down will increase their, feeling of like anger.
Yeah, totally. So I think in general, for all of the misinformation stuff, there's this trade-off between spread of misinformation and censorship, which are both things that are bad. And there's some, all these different interventions are things, or let's say both of things are normatively undesirable. And so you have to choose where you want to be on that surface. But a lot of actually what I like about the accuracy nudges is they kind of sidestep that because there is no censorship. It's just trying to get the people to share less stuff without the platform deciding who's doing the bad thing and so on.
Really cool and creative.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you have any data on how, what effect the nudges have over time. Social media behavior is very dynamic. And if you're talking about scaling it, rather than putting exposure or
Yep. Yeah, it's a super important question. We don't really know. At least I can say over well, actually, so there's two separate questions, where one is how long does an individual nudge last for? And then the question is when you repeat it, like how quickly do people desensitize to it? And they're both important questions that we don't really know the answer. It's like hard to assess it in a survey context because you can't have people, come back and again and again and again. And again, a lot of the motivation for this project, where we were looking at a bunch of different ways to do it, is to try to fight the adaptation by saying, look, you can have a whole menu of, it's not like you have to ask this one question again and again, but if you just give them anything that has to do with accuracy, it's going to shift their attention to it. And so I was just talking to people at a social media platform today and saying, like, look, if you're going to do this, it's not going to work if you just pick one thing and ask them that same question again and again. Like you can see that with the Twitter, are you sure you want to share this? You haven't read it thing. The first time it happens, you're like, whoa. And by now I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. Just, it's like totally is not a thing anymore. And so I think that I'm sure that people do desensitize to it. And so I think the solution to that is just to have a wide variety of these so no person sees the same thing particularly regularly.
So one last question.
Kind of related to the question from over there. For people who are likely to share misinformation, when they hear about this nudge, like, what's their reaction? Have you met someone who shares a lot of information and told them about this, and what do they say?
It's a good question. I don't know specifically for high misinformation sharers. In the cross-cultural study, at the end, we explained to people, remember that thing where at the beginning we asked you if you wanted, like how accurate a random headline is? The reason we did that was to help you share more accurate news. Like, how helpful do you think it was and how much did you like the feature? And very few people disliked it. Most people were just kind of neutral, and most people thought it didn't do anything, even though it did, which also is a downside. It shows the limits of asking people how effective they think things were. And in fact, so we found that we also had a treatment in the cross-cultural study using the digital literacy tips, and so people in the tips condition thought it was much more helpful than people in the just like evaluation judge the random thing, even though judge the random thing was twice as effective as the tips. But in terms of your question, at least for the general public, people don't hate them, which is what the platforms are worried about. Oh, they're going to think this is weird or manipulative or whatever. But it is an interesting question of specifically the people that are sharing a lot of misinformation, what they make of it. I would be reasonably optimistic that they wouldn't hate it, because the thing is that in general, there's actually bipartisan dislike of misinformation. There's just and so for some very notable examples, there's also big disagreement on what is misinformation. But actually for most stuff, there's much less disagreement about misinformation than you might think, and there's basically widespread desire not to spread misinformation.
Okay,
Great, thanks so much. Should I stop the record? Should I stop the recording?